Hey guys, how are you today? So this is the last lecture for first semester. Woo, I'm pumped. So today's lecture is we're going to be talking about the end of chapter 7, section 3, and we're going to be talking about kind of just what's happening in the early 1900s as far as the age of imperialism and how we're going to see some political changes occur as we see some new presidents come into office. We're going to be talking about President Taft, who's a one-term president. And then we'll be talking about the beginning of President Wilson's time in office before World War I. So we'll be covering mostly stuff from 7-3. I'll throw in kind of a splash of things from chapter 8 as well as we kind of overview what you'll be watching in the president videos. Your big, motivation at this point is to get your project done first. And if you need help, please talk to me. Please email me. Get that done first. It's due tomorrow by midnight, and you're going to want to upload your newspaper plus your list of sources to Google Classroom and then comment on someone else's project on Padlet as you upload yours. You're going to want to start working on the review questions, playing the Kahoot, doing this last lecture, uploading your president notes, kind of getting everything wrapped up, and then starting on Wednesday, you'll be eligible to take your test. And I mean, if you take it Wednesday, after we're going to have a Google Meet Monday, Tuesday this week, an additional one Wednesday. You only need to attend one. You're welcome to attend both. Wednesday at the Google Meet, we'll just be going over the review sheet, playing the Kahoot, but you could potentially be done, and with my class at least, and start your Christmas break on Wednesday as long as you get everything done. These are going to be your last chances to get your missing work done, to get everything caught up. I know it's a push. It always is. And then you're really going to enjoy your break, and I hope you stay healthy and happy and have a wonderful holiday. I look forward to seeing you all next semester, and if not, you'll love Mr. Kreiner's class because I know that I've got a lot of his students coming in, which means unfortunately I must be leaving you guys. A lot of you guys must be kind of switching teachers. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about President Taft and President Wilson here. So first I want to talk about is W.H. Taft, or William Howard Taft. You might remember this man from U.S. history in 8th grade. I feel like your middle school teachers mentioned him at some point. A lot of kids seem to be familiar with him because they're like, I know him. He's the fat president, which is obviously the most unkind thing to say ever. But, when you're talking about the early 1900s, you didn't see American obesity as quite of a problem. America has really shifted in the past 60 years. Really the past, 70 years since World War II is really when the shift has occurred. And prior to that time, we saw that, weight was very different in America. People didn't eat fast food. Restaurants didn't have huge portion sizes. People didn't eat so much processed food. They ate at home more. They ate a lot more fruits and vegetables. They didn't drink as much soda and as many sugary drinks. And so American society has changed. And we really saw the shift being that, years ago, if you were poor, you were most likely skinny. Whereas now, we see that's not the case. Many people who are on the lower end of the social economic status, they're going to be eating a lot of processed American foods, and a lot of those lower cost processed foods that are inexpensive, unfortunately have a lot of sodium packed in and hidden calories and fats and things like that, which, we have people who are, in the obese category. So it was a little bit unusual to see people that were so extremely overweight. People remember Taft because he's the president who gets stuck in the bathtub, and he goes ahead and he puts in the Olympic-size kind of swimming pool into the White House. Now, Taft actually kind of made a name for himself because he'd been governor of the Philippines. So he really and truly had played a role, early on during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and trying to bring peace to the Philippines, to try to end that war successfully and then trying to govern those people. He definitely kind of believed in imperialism, white man's burden, social Darwinism, thought they were justified in being the Philippines, didn't want to see an excessive use of force or violence against those people, but was very excited to help govern that territory and gain more land for the United States. And he was a close personal friend of Teddy Roosevelt. Many people would say he was Teddy Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. Remember, Roosevelt came into office because he was finishing up McKinley's second term. And he counted that basically as his own turn. Then he ran for the presidency himself in 1904 and got elected and promised Americans, a square deal, a fair deal, and was a trust buster and had all these progressive reforms and definitely supported imperialism and, had these, believed in big stick diplomacy, that we were going to speak softly but carry a big stick and increase the size of our Navy and, try to build a Panama Canal and expand the size of the U.S. Well, eventually his term had to come to an end. So at the end of Teddy Roosevelt's official first term in office in 1908, he considered that his second term. There was so much more he wanted to do, but he said that he was done. He wasn't going to be the president again. That there'd never been a president who'd had more than 2 terms, so he left office. And if you look at this political cartoon, it's got Teddy Roosevelt on an elephant, because the elephant is a symbol of the Republican Party. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt had been leader of the Rough Riders, and he's kind of pushing Taft to the White House, his good buddy. And there had been a lot of jokes, political cartoons or the memes of olden days, and people making fun of the fact that he really kind of pushed the Republican Party to make Taft president. Taft didn't even really want it. His wife, his family really wanted it. He kind of wanted it. And then as soon as he became president, he was very unhappy. He ate even more and more. Hence, when he got stuck in the bathtub, he gained 100 pounds while in office. He was very stressed, anxious. It did not make him happy. He felt just the weight of the world on his shoulders as America was trying to become, one of the most powerful countries in the world. Now, was he a good president? Was he a bad president? That's going to be kind of up to you to decide as you're watching that president clip and you're giving him a rating and writing down your 5 facts. But he did have a lot of accomplishments as a progressive president. Remember, progressive meaning someone who's focused on change, reform, trying to make America a better place. For one thing, he actually busted twice as many trusts as Teddy Roosevelt. So he really focuses on getting the Justice Department, the Attorney General, so the head lawyer for the country, to go after big companies and say, you are violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, and this constitutes a monopoly, and monopolies are bad because you're a rubber baron, you're making all the money, you're not paying your employees anything. It means high prices for the consumer because there's no competition, and so he's all about trying to bring forward legislation to break them apart. He's also focused on the environment. He creates a Bureau of Mines to try to look into the safety, the welfare of people who work in mines because the conditions were so unsafe. They didn't fully understand that working in mines could lead to health problems. They saw a lot of chest colds back then. They didn't understand pneumonia, though, or about lung cancer, or anything like that quite yet, but they're starting to get an idea. He's also trying to put land aside to protect our natural resources and oil and things like that. And he's not, there's going to be some constant debate going on about whether we should drill for oil in places or not. He also is a big proponent of the 16th Amendment of creating a direct income tax, trying to make sure that wealthy people paid more money in taxes compared to the poor. Now remember, up until this point in history, America never had an income tax. People never paid taxes. They didn't want that as part of our country. They were fearful of paying taxes. Remember, it was one of the reasons originally why the colonists had been protesting against from England. They said, we're not going to pay these high taxes to help pay off the French and Indian War. They had a big chanting slogans like no taxation without representation in Parliament. So in the beginning, at least, Americans never really wanted any kind of taxation program. They just paid taxes on certain goods like tobacco or alcohol as they bought them. But now they're talking about, of course, creating an actual tax that all Americans paid, and it would be graduated, meaning that it would be based off your wealth, which is the same way it is today. And it should be the idea that, if you're a millionaire, if you're a billionaire, you should be paying a lot more money in taxes. The average American should not be paying all this money in taxes when we don't make that much money. Him and his wife in particular, and a muckraker by the name of Florence Kelley, were very interested in child labor. They helped create the Children's Bureau, which kind of investigated how many hours a day children were working, tried to get pamphlets out about, how this is wrong, how children need to get an education, how they're in school. The Children's Bureau also started looking into adoption, child abuse, childhood hunger, lack of education, some different issues there. And they still have those things today. It's how at the state level today we still have DCFS and institutions like that to try to, make sure that, child welfare is, being protected. Other things about his domestic agenda. Remember, we're talking about domestic agenda. We were talking about policies that he passed in the United States. One of the things that's going to happen is that even though he believed that all Americans should pay some kind of income tax, he had some different views about taxes on imported goods, which are called tariffs. And President McKinley, when he was in office, remember, he was a big supporter of high tariffs on imported goods. Okay, so meaning that, if people wanted to buy, a tire, let's say, from China, okay, originally, if they go to the store, and same thing today, if you go to Walmart, Americans are like, I want to buy the cheapest tire. Okay, well, back then, if the cheapest tire was $50, they might want to buy it because that's all they can afford, and, they're looking for what's cheap. They're not really looking at whether it's made in the United States or not. So what ends up happening is that people like President McKinley, when he was in office, before he was even in office, he had gotten the McKinley tariff passed, and a tariff is a tax on imports. So what happens is if you put a tax on imported goods, it takes that $50 Chinese tire, and if the American tire was $70, you put a $25 tariff or tax on the Chinese made good, which would be an insane tariff, right? That would be 50%. They're not probably going to do one that high. But if they would, all of a sudden the Chinese tire would be $75. The American tire would only be $70, and so people would buy the American made good. People in government, usually congressmen and women, presidents, they want, very often high tariffs, taxes on imported goods because that's good for, American businesses. So McKinley wanted that. Teddy Roosevelt wanted that, and you can see the advantage. It's really good, for the American business owner. But there's also another perspective, okay? And here's the other perspective. If the Chinese tire was originally $50 and the American tire was $70, and now we just put a tax on the Chinese one to make it $75, so the Americans buy the $70 tire. Okay, but there still was really and truly originally only a $50 tire. Yes, it's great to support American-made businesses and products and employees, but if you're starving, if you're really struggling, and I say tire, thinking tires of a car, and back then, if you were buying tires for a car, you're probably not struggling, right? Because most Americans couldn't even afford a car. But bear with me here. It was the first thing that came to mind. And I was kind of more thinking of modern day tires, honestly. But if you're, really struggling, why couldn't you just buy the $50 tire to begin with? So the other political view, the view of the Progressive Party and of the Democratic Party is, why don't we just not have tariffs? Why don't we not have taxes on imported goods? Why don't we let the imported goods kind of flow in a bit? Because then Americans who are really poor, they can obviously just buy the $50 tire, and it's saving them money that they can use on food, bills, their home, vacation, their kids, you name it. So there is definitely a view that when you have a high tariff or a tax on imported goods, it helps American businesses to grow. But it also doesn't really help the poor families, the average consumers. And most Americans at this time were poor. There wasn't really much of a middle class. We're starting to see it grow, but it's still pretty small at this point. It's not really going to grow to World War I. So progressives really supported low tariffs. And Taft is all about, really the progressive view of having low tariffs. He passes a law called the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which cuts tariffs on some imported goods. And so he supports the progressive view, the Democratic view. It kind of breaks tradition with what Teddy Roosevelt had seen. And Teddy Roosevelt, was kind of a psycho. He couldn't let go of the fact that he wasn't president anymore. And he's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he got Congress to pass this law called the Payne-Aldrich tariff. And he signed it into law, and he cut taxes on foreign goods. And he's helping out the Progressive Party and the Democrats. He was just really freaked out by this. And he started to call Taft all sorts of names, like, how can you be a Republican, but you're acting like a progressive? Well, remember, we talked about this before. Teddy Roosevelt is supposedly a Republican, but acts more like a progressive Democrat. So there's a lot of name calling going on, and the two of them are starting to not getting along. The other issue they were fighting about was when Teddy Roosevelt was in office, he really listened to his friend, a guy by the name of Pinchot, as far as what should happen to America's natural resources, how much land should be protected, as far as national parks, the Grand Canyon, things like that shouldn't be developed, for land, for wealth. And what happens is that, when Taft becomes president, he puts another one of their mutual friends, a guy by the name of Ballinger, who Teddy Roosevelt was friends with as well, but Taft is kind of better friends with him. He puts him into the job as far as being in charge of our natural resources And Ballinger actually ends up selling some of the land that Teddy Roosevelt had originally put aside and says, you know what, we don't need all this land for natural resources, for hiking, for parks. We think there's oil on there. We don't think wildlife habitats are going to be destroyed. We're going to sell 3 million acres of this land because we think oil might be on it, and we want Americans to be dependent on our own sources of oil compared to foreign oil. And it's just going to generate huge revenue, right, for businessmen like Rockefeller and things like that. So he sells it. Well, that was kind of like the last straw. Like, Teddy Roosevelt absolutely flips out, and he publicly calls Taft like an idiot and all sorts of names, and it's this Ballinger-Pinchot affair because Pinchot and Ballinger, who are supposedly both conservationists, kind of fight each other just verbally in words and say nasty things about each other. And Teddy Roosevelt really supports Pinchot, and Taft really supports Ballinger, and they're fighting over what should happen in the environment. And this is what's really going to lead Teddy Roosevelt to decide that he's going to run for the presidency again against Taft. And honestly, as I said, Taft really does not want to be president at all during this time. Now let's talk about Taft's foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy, I told you before that Taft does support imperialism. You know, he understands the important need for the United States to build up its army and navy and to secure territory around the world to show that we're a world power. He does somewhat believe in social Darwinism and white man's burden, you know, conning himself into believing that we're actually helping others by conquering them, that it's our duty. And he doesn't want to see as much violence, though, because, you know, he'd been to the Philippines, he'd seen the bloodshed, he tried to create peace, and honestly, he was more of a laid-back kind of a peaceful guy. He's not like so war-crazed the way Teddy Roosevelt was. He kind of got roped into doing a lot of that work. And so he does not want to continue to just conquer other nations. He says that's just going to lead us into a fight because the British and the Germans and the French are starting to get real antsy and real nervous about who is going to be the biggest world power and who's going to seize more land in Africa and around the globe. And he didn't want to get caught up into that fight that was growing and growing and growing. We're starting to see a lot more violence kind of break out in Eastern Europe. It's kind of the Balkan powder keg there by Greece. And we're definitely on the verge of World War I, which is just going to start here in just a few years. So in 1909, when Taft becomes president, he says, you know what, he's still going to support, you know, the Roosevelt Corollary, the add-on to the original Monroe Doctrine. You know, if somebody would try to attack a country in Central or South America, clearly the United States Army and Navy would protect that country. And he believes in speak softly, carry a big stick, meaning like we have a big army, we have a big navy. We are not going to actually use them, though, to attack. We're just going to let people know that our presence is there, and we will kind of defend any Latin American country if need be. But, you know, these Latin American countries, a lot of them are still in trouble, and they owe money to European nations. Some of them are thinking about, you know, becoming socialist countries where everyone is equal in terms of wealth. Americans have a real fear of socialism, that it's going to turn violent, that people perhaps would try to convince Americans to become socialist and that they would support like a violent overthrow of the government and stealing of property and wealth, and it just scared the heck out of us. So his plan, instead of sending in troops to Central South America, these Latin American countries, to try to help them become democratic, you know, and to support, you know, these imperialist ideas that started under Roosevelt with big stick diplomacy, the addition, you know, to the Monroe Doctrine, this Roosevelt Corollary, he comes up with something called dollar diplomacy. And he says, what's going to happen is we are an incredibly wealthy country, and we really were at that point, you know, very low national debt. People think about America today and they're like, oh, America's so powerful, we're so wealthy. Okay, we are powerful. We do have a huge navy and army, but we are not wealthy by any means. We have a huge, huge national debt. Google it. It's in the trillions of dollars. And as, you know, our economy continues to falter, it's a problem. You get other countries like China, which are continuously buying up more and more of our debt, which is scary. What happens if eventually they call in that debt? It could be real problems. So, you know, when people say we're the most powerful country in the world, perhaps maybe for now. Do I know if that's going to be that way always? No. No, I have no idea what the future holds, especially if we don't clean up our act and stop spending money. So at this point, though, Americans had money, and we believe in dollar diplomacy. Diplomacy is a way of kind of working out conflicts without physically fighting. Usually it involves words. With dollar diplomacy, we basically say we're going to give loans to any country like Nicaragua was struggling, Guatemala, Dominican Republic. We're going to give a lot of these countries loans, money, to make sure that they can repay their debts from foreign countries, so they can try to rebuild roads, which will create jobs for people, try to improve their standard of living so that they have more money, so they actually have food and they're not starving. We're going to give them food, supplies, and goods to try to ensure that they don't become a socialist country, because more countries are turning to socialism, and thinking that that's the route that they should take. We'll talk about how Russia becomes a true socialist communist country here at the end of World War I in 1919. And socialism scares us because it does support that violent mentality of killing people, at least in the beginning of a crazy coup d'etat, of an overthrow of the government, of seizing property and wealth. Now, it would be fantastic if Taft's foreign policy of dollar diplomacy had worked. And I'll attach a video clip to this post so that you can watch it if you want. It's like 4 minutes long from History Channel. It gives you some more information, but it doesn't work. We try it in China, and we also try it in Nicaragua. We give them huge loans. They can rebuild roads, bridges, canals, harbors, create new jobs. We try to give them money to build schools and hospitals because, yet again, education is important, thinking about the next generation. And also, it creates jobs because you need someone to build the school. You need to hire a teacher, all these different things. But honestly, it doesn't work. It's just not enough. And we actually end up sending in tons of troops by 1912, by the end of Taft's presidency as well, to try to stop violence there and to try to aid the people. And so since we end up just using violence and force anyway, clearly it's not the best policy. So Taft really and truly does not want to run for re-election. He really doesn't have any desire to be the president again, but the Republican Party thinks he has done a fantastic job, and they actually want him to run for a second term. The Democratic Party is going to be putting forward a new candidate named Woodrow Wilson. At the same time, Teddy Roosevelt is going to decide to run for the presidency again in 1912 because he is so angry with Taft's failed kind of dollar diplomacy and disagreement about taxes and the environment. And then there's also another candidate, Eugene Debs. And we've talked about Debs before, how he was head of the American Railway Union at the Pullman strike. It turned into a national strike. He ends up serving time in jail. He perhaps served time in jail because he ignored that court order, the injunction, which said that he had to move the train cars off the track because it was stopping the U.S. mail from being delivered, and that's a federal offense if you stop the delivery of mail. He purposely kind of did that, some people say. Other people say that Pullman's guards did that. Remember, they were on strike at the Pullman factory because they wanted better pay, shorter hours. They couldn't afford to pay their rent. And then it turned into a general strike where anyone who worked for a train was not working, and it basically kind of shut down the country until Cleveland sent in the army to kind of break up the strike. And since Debs was head of the ARU, he went to jail for violating that court order. And a lot of people said it was because he was a socialist. When he gets out of jail, he starts thinking about, his next move, and he creates a new union called the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. It's made up of skilled and unskilled workers, and it's basically the socialist version of the capitalist American Federation of Labor. It eventually becomes too radical for even Debs because they kind of support the spread of socialism by using violence, by using force. And remember, when we talk about capitalism versus socialism and communism, capitalism is at one end. It's what we have. It's focused on private property, wealth. You can get a job. You can work where you want. You can open a business. You spend your money how you want. The government really doesn't get involved or tell you what to do. Great. On the downside, you might have people who are super poor. The opposite end of the system is communism, where the government completely controls where you work, where you shop, what you buy, how much goods are. Yes, everyone is equal in terms of wealth. There's no poor people, but there's also complete government control and no freedom. Socialism, which is what Deb kind of really supported, is a mixture of the two. The government controls certain things like how much steel is sold for, how much oil is sold for, or healthcare, or education. But you're still allowed to open up your own little hair salon or shoe store or grocery store. So you can have a small business, but some major things that all people need, like fire departments, police stations, things like that, are all controlled by the government. But there are people out there who support really a violent use of socialism. Not all people, but there are some people, at least at this point in history. And Debs actually kind of breaks apart from this group eventually, but he does decide to run for the presidency. He says Americans want change. That's evident because the Progressive Party has brought about some reforms in America and gotten new laws passed, and the middle class has shown they want change. So he feels like this is the time to push for that change. And it's not just about some progressive reforms. He wants lots of progressive reforms, and he wants to bring about them through socialism. So in this election, to sum it up, as I said, you've got Woodrow Wilson running as a Democratic candidate. You've got Taft running as the Republican candidate. You've got Roosevelt, who decides he wants to run, and he is outraged that the Republican Party doesn't nominate him as their candidate. He says, fine, I'm creating my whole own political party. It's the Progressive Party, and my symbol is going to be the bull moose, and I'm running on a platform of new nationalism. And then Debs, he runs as well as the socialist candidate. Debs actually does get about 1 million votes, which shows you that there are people out there who want extreme change in America at this point. So 1 million votes, though, that's not really that much. It really isn't going to break the bank. So if you notice, Debs getting 1 million votes, not even quite 1 million, 900,000. He only gets about 6% of the popular vote. So here's the real thing that happens. You've got 3 major candidates. Most people wouldn't even count Debs. Debs, would be like the Kanye West of this past election. He really didn't do anything super important. But if you notice, in America in this last election, right, people were voting for Biden, right, as the Democratic candidate, or they were voting for Trump as the Republican candidate. We, for the most part, are a two-party system. Were there other candidates? Yeah, there was Jo Jorgensen. She was a Libertarian Party candidate. There was a Green Party candidate. The problem is, if people start to vote the way our system is currently set up, and it has been for years, if they vote for that third-party candidate, it messes up the numbers, and it takes votes away from somebody else. For example, the views of Jorgensen were similar to the views of Biden. So all those people who voted Jorgensen, if Jorgensen wasn't allowed to run, they most likely would have voted for Biden. Their views were a lot similar. And the views here you can see kind of are split as well. So if you were a Republican in the 1912 election, you had a real moral dilemma. Should you vote for Teddy Roosevelt, who had served America well for almost 2 terms, who you knew was a successful candidate and would bring about great change and was a war hero, but he considered himself now a kind of a member of a new political party. Should you take a chance in that new political party? And the fact that he was so desperate to run again and become president, was he too power hungry? Or should you vote for Taft, who'd done a decent enough job, had some failures though with dollar diplomacy? Should you vote and run, support him, in this election? People really didn't know what to think. And so when it comes down to it, 23% of the popular vote went to Taft, and about 27% went to Roosevelt, okay? Roosevelt, I always go back and forth, and I never can remember how to say it, right? So it basically split that vote. So who actually won the most popular vote in comparison? The Democrat, which was Wilson. So he gets the popular vote, and he also ends up getting the electoral vote, and he becomes the next president of the United States. Now, here's the thing. If, there had only been one Republican candidate, you see it, okay, I know you do, that would have been a solid 50% of the vote. So if there'd only been one Republican candidate, that would have been 50% of Americans voting Republican, and you would have seen another Republican in office, because more Americans at this time, remember, were all voting Republican rather than Democrat. The only Democratic president we've had up until this point was Cleveland, who served the 2 non-consecutive terms. So basically, by having 3 major candidates, it split the vote. And it just kind of takes one vote away from somebody else. Why is our system like that? It's a system that we've had in place basically for years, going back to the founding of our country. We can split it, but that's just kind of what the founders created. But for now, a lot of people, when they say, I want to vote for the Green Party, I want to vote for Libertarian, I want to vote for Kanye West, you can, but you're not really going to truly have a huge impact in the election. And you can see with the amount of electoral votes, Wilson became president. Now, speaking of that, today is going to be the day when they officially cast the electoral votes as well for President-elect Biden. And so President Biden will be officially inaugurated. It should be in January 20th, I believe. So that'll just be a few weeks away. So Wilson becomes president, and we're not going to talk a lot about Wilson's policies, but in terms of Wilson's domestic policies, meaning what he does for the United States, he had campaigned on a new freedom campaign, definitely supporting some progressive ideals, and he supports a lower tariff or a lower tax on imported goods. Okay, so he definitely supports the average American consumer. So back to my tire example, he wants Americans just, who can't afford to buy anything. He wants to get rid of those taxes on imported goods, and so that they could buy the $50 Chinese tire if they wanted. So do the businessmen, the robber barons like him? Not so much. He's definitely more so about supporting the average American person. Officially, the 16th Amendment gets passed while he's the president, but they've been working on that since Taft's administration. And so yet again, this will kind of offset the money that was lost from the McKinley tariff, because now they're going to be getting money, right, as people pay taxes in April, and that exists to this day. And it is a graduated income tax, meaning the more money you have, the higher taxes you pay. Also, in terms of domestic policies, the Federal Reserve Act is passed. And you have to understand that our bank system was really messed up back then. Originally, we had people who were obviously paying in coinage, right, with gold and silver coins, and your money was backed up by gold. So your paper money is only valuable because we know it is supported by gold. You can't just go and print more money if you're out. Otherwise, it's not worth anything. It's no different than any other paper per se. And we had banks all over the United States were very unstable. They were giving out loans to people who really shouldn't have been getting loans. Some of these wildcat banks, really were doing all sorts of, shady things that they shouldn't have been doing. So they eventually created this system. What we have today, it's called the Federal Reserve Act, and it splits the country into these different 12 districts. And if you notice, we're in District 7 for Chicago. Our Federal Reserve Center is out of Chicago. And basically, that's where our money, it's not printed there, but if, for example, you get a $5 bill, and if you have a $5 bill and it's really worn out and it looks like it's falling apart, eventually, as you use it somewhere, it's going to eventually get deposited into a bank. That bank is going to ship that money back to the Federal Reserve in Chicago. It'll get destroyed there, even though the money's not printed there. And they'll eventually kind of send, a different $5 bill back out kind of into circulation, because they kind of destroy and retire some of that money. Also, if you have a checking account, which you need to get one once you, start to be 16, 17, 18 here and get a job and start saving money, you'll need a saving and a checking. But as you write a check and keep track of your finances on how you're spending your money, some of the, different wire transfers as money is taken from one checking account and put into another banking account, that all happens there. So the whole point of this Federal Reserve Act is to kind of break up the country into smaller sections, and then Chicago could basically watch what was happening in those, small banks across the country and small towns, but at least in our section, to make sure that they weren't giving out loans to people who couldn't pay them back, and to try to make sure the banks were making smart choices. Because if banks give out too many loans to people who can't give them back, the bank will fall apart. And, people will then feel that their money is unsafe. They'll worry if they'll ever get their money back out of their account. And it could lead to kind of just a distrust by the American people of banks. And it could lead to people spending less money. And if there is less money in circulation, that could lead to an overall downturn in the economy. He also passes the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is just another version of the Sherman Antitrust Act, to try to make sure monopolies can't exist, to try to break them apart. He's also trying to create a Workmen's Compensation Act for the first time. So at least for government employees, like if you are rebuilding a road, when you're a government contractor, if you get hurt on the job, they're going to pay your health bills. And he tries to create a law to outlaw child labor. It's ruled unconstitutional. That won't come about till the Great Depression, but we're moving in the right direction. About done here. In terms of his foreign policy, he's going to continue to support, the Teddy Roosevelt's idea of the Roosevelt Corollary, of, speak softly, carry a big stick, protect those Latin American countries and Central South America. He has this tag phrase. He says, I want to keep the world safe for democracy, meaning I want people to have the ability to choose what kind of government they have, what kind of economy they have. And of course, he isn't pro-socialism. He definitely is pro-capitalist system. Unlike Taft, he said, dollar diplomacy didn't really work. We're going to have to be willing to use force if necessary. And he, of course, feels that way about what happens in Germany. He'll be our president during World War I. And he says we will bring troops into countries if need be. But he really feels, kind of buys into the white man's burden a little bit and social Darwinism. He buys into what he calls moral diplomacy. And he says the U.S. really does have a duty as Anglo-Saxon, even though we're not British, as white people, to teach Latin Americans how to create a democratic society. It's definitely kind of a racist mentality, as you see in that political cartoon there. And this just to kind of shows you that, yes, we definitely do intervene during his presidency. We get involved in Haiti. We get involved in the Dominican Republic. We get involved in the Virgin Islands. We've got more action going on in Cuba. So we continue to kind of really, we also have big interventions in Mexico to try to have a democratic government there. So he sends in troops all over the place to try to create stable governments there. And part of that is because some of these operations today would be occurring perhaps more covertly, more secretly by the CIA, which did not exist at this point in time. Now, did everybody like what was happening, by Taft and Wilson? No. You're going to have political cartoons like this one, which shows Uncle Sam playing against the British and some of these other nations, as you've got Germany and Spain and France here and Japan, as they are kind of fighting over Puerto Rico, Cuba, and these different territories. And Uncle Sam is one of the boys, as if it's a poker game, and they're just betting on who gets each piece of land. So there were definitely a lot of people who were against imperialism here and what America was doing as far as intervening in these countries. They said, these countries are not children. We understand that you want to perhaps help them, but your efforts are misguided. Simply drop off food, supplies if you really want to help them, perhaps give them some education, but you're bringing in military force. You're basically forcing them to have governments. You're making them reliant on the U.S. just to create new markets, new places to sell our goods to, and basically to get slave labor. So there definitely was anti-imperialist leagues and groups out there who were continuously fighting against what we'd been doing in the Philippines for years, in Puerto Rico and Guam and Cuba, and now, in Mexico and Nicaragua and these Central South American countries. All right, guys, that wraps us up for now. Last lecture of the semester. Have a great day, guys. Get it all done. Email me if you need help. Later.